Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. I was deliberating about the topic to discuss today, and I figured I'd just talk about the resurrection of Jesus since we are in Easter season. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, if Christ is not raised from the dead, then your faith is in vain. So that means the resurrection of Jesus is the reason for the Christian faith. In 1 Peter 3:15, Peter says that always be prepared to give a defense for any man that asks you for the reason of the hope within you, with gentleness and respect. What that means is that the Bible requires Christians to be able to give reasons for the hope that they have within them. And if the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the reason we have hope, then I think it's important that Christians are able to give reasons why the resurrection is true. And unbelievers or people who are not Christians, skeptics who are watching this video, can also look through this and reconsider Christianity if they are not already. The resurrection of Jesus was proved by the early disciples as a literal historical event that occurred. So that means that it can be investigated using historical principles. Historians have a number of principles that they use to determine whether something is credible or not. So we are going to be examining these principles, and then we use these principles to establish some facts that cumulatively lead to the conclusion that Jesus must have risen from the dead. The first principle is the principle of multiple attestation. If you have multiple sources reporting a particular thing, it's highly likely it's true. For example, if an accident occurs and multiple witnesses tell you that the accident was caused by a red car, it's highly likely it's true because you have multiple independent attestation. The second principle is the principle of enemy attestation. If your brother walks up to you and tells you you're a very kind person, that's probably true, but maybe you have a reason to doubt because they have an incentive to make you look good. But if an enemy walks up to you and tells you you're a kind person, it's probably true because they have no reason to create a narrative that suits you. So that is the second historiographical principle that historians use to determine whether something is historically credible. The third principle is the principle of embarrassing admissions. So if you have a source where the reporter is writing things that hurt either themselves or the community that they belong to, it's highly likely it's true because they have no incentive to make themselves look bad, right? The fourth principle is the principle of proximity of the sources to the events. So if you have a source that is writing 400 years after the event or 500 years after the event, it's obviously less valuable than a source that is coming 13 years after the event or 20 years after the event. So that's the fourth principle. The fifth principle is an examination of the motives of the reporters. So do the reporters have an incentive to create a narrative that goes a particular way? Do they have an axe to grind? Do they have a stake in the events they're reporting? If they do, it means the historian has to be very cautious in accepting the claims that they make. So that's the fifth principle. Having examined the five principles or five of the principles that historians use to determine if something is historically credible or not, we are going to be examining some key facts surrounding the life of Jesus that are generally agreed upon by all scholars, whether they are secular or whether they are Christian. And we are going to see how these facts align with the principles and how cumulatively they lead to the conclusion that Jesus must have risen from the dead. So the first one is the crucifixion of Jesus. The crucifixion of Jesus is incredibly well attested. Right? We have Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian who joined the Romans during the Jewish-Roman wars, and he wasn't a Christian. Reporting about Jesus, he points out that Jesus Christ was the brother of James. Jesus Christ was killed. His brother was also killed. So right there, we have an attestation that Jesus Christ was killed by the Jews. The second source that we have is Tacitus. So Tacitus was a professional Roman historian. What that means is that he wasn't just an average person who was writing, he was actually a professional historian. And he writes about how Christianity was problematic for the Roman Empire, how the early Christians were being persecuted by the Roman leadership like Nero. And he reports that Jesus Christ suffered the ultimate penalty, that is crucifixion, under Pontius Pilate. He even called Christianity a pernicious superstition. What that means is that he's not a Christian. He doesn't think Christianity is anything wholesome. He just thinks it's a nuisance in the Roman Empire. And he reports that Jesus Christ was crucified. The third source is Marabera Serapion. He was a Syrian philosopher who was imprisoned by the leadership at the time in Syria, and he wrote to his son not to despair too much because noble people are usually persecuted by the people around them. He spoke about Socrates, who was sentenced to death by poisoning because he was asking a lot of questions. And then he spoke about Jesus. He called Jesus a wise king who was unjustly persecuted and sentenced to death by the Jews. He didn't mention that Jesus died by crucifixion, but he pointed out that Jesus Christ was sentenced to death under the Jewish leadership. And then we have the Talmud. So the Talmud was a collection of rabbinical writings that reported that on the eve of the Passover, Jesus Christ was sentenced to death or was crucified. And he was referred to as Yeshu. Yeshu was crucified on the eve of the Passover. Then we have other sources like Lucian. We have the entirety of the New Testament reporting the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It's very important to note here that crucifixion was actually a very vile way to sentence someone to death. It was the punishment reserved for the worst of criminals. No Roman citizen was ever condemned to crucifixion. No Roman citizen ever, no matter their crime, because crucifixion was reserved for the lowest of people in the Greco-Roman Empire at the time. It's almost like having someone bent in a tower and calling the person God. There was no way the Christians at the time had an incentive to create a narrative that included Jesus being crucified if he wasn't crucified. So we have multiple attestations surrounding the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. That is the first fact, and it coheres well with the principles we have. The second fact surrounding the life of Jesus Christ is the fact that he was buried in a tomb and then his tomb was found empty. So, first of all, it was the custom at the time to have people buried in tombs. It's almost like coming down to Ghana and someone dies and you hear that the person had a ceremonial funeral. You don't really need specific independent evidence besides that the person had a ceremonial funeral, because it's very common to have people buried, have ceremonial funerals for people before they are buried. So it's not something you really need independent testimony for. But besides that, the narrative that Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were the ones who had Jesus Christ buried is extremely unlikely to have been an invention. This is because there was animals between the early Christians at the time and then the Jewish leadership and establishment at the time, because the Christians believed that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. So there was no way they were going to create a narrative that attributed a noble work to the members of the Jewish leadership at the time if it wasn't true. So historians generally believe that the narrative of Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea burying Jesus is highly likely to be true. The third thing is the early apologetics surrounding the claims of the resurrection of Jesus. Most of the Jews at the time are reported to have said that the disciples stole the body. Even by the 2nd century, we still have historical records that the claims were that Jesus Christ's disciples stole the body. The reason this is significant is that if you're a teacher and then a student comes to class and the student says, a dog eats my homework, that implicitly means that their homework is not present. So if the disciples or the critics of Jesus were claiming that the disciples stole the body, it is implicit evidence that Jesus Christ's body was not in the tomb, which means there was an empty tomb. The third thing is the testimony of the women. So the Gospels, for example, reports that the resurrection of Jesus or the empty tomb was first witnessed by women. The reason this is significant was that, unfortunately, in the ancient Jewish context at the time, the testimony of women was not regarded. So there are reports about multiple men or multiple women having their testimony equaling one woman, and a woman's testimony being like unnecessary, or a woman's testimony being less valuable than a man's. So it's unlikely that early Christians wanting to create a narrative where Jesus rose from the dead would create a narrative that included women being the first to see Jesus's body, because it hurts the credibility of their own testimony. So the fact that they report that women were the first people to see the empty tomb of Jesus Christ is evidence that the empty tomb actually existed, and this is something that historians generally accept. The last thing is the Nazarene Edict. So this is not really direct evidence, right? But the Nazarene Edict was an edict or a decree that was made by a Roman emperor, probably Claudius, which stated that if anyone disturbed a Roman tomb, or if anyone disturbed a tomb in a Roman empire, the person was to be sentenced to death. The interesting thing about this is that the edict was found a few years after Jesus Christ died, and then Christianity started causing trouble in the Roman Empire, and it's reported to have been found in Nazareth, which is why it's called the Nazarene Edict. And it's just suspicious that right after the disciples start causing trouble in the Roman Empire surrounding the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, such an edict should arise. So it's really powerful circumstantial evidence supporting the empty tomb. So that's the second claim, the second historical claim. The third historical point is that the disciples of Jesus claimed that they saw the risen Christ, and they preached it so much to the point where they were willing to die for it. So our earliest source for this, or our earliest sources for this, actually come from Paul. Now, someone might object that Paul is in the Bible and you're quoting the Bible to prove the Bible. But remember that historians consider the individual books in the Bible as historical literature or historical documents in which they find historical facts. So they can just use the principles that I outlined earlier to determine whether a claim is likely to be true or not. So when you study the epistles of Paul, in 1 Corinthians comes 17 years after Jesus Christ died. And in comparison, Alexander the Great's earliest sources we have for him come 400 years later. So that's like really, really proximate. Paul's letters are really proximate to the claims. The reason this is important is that it gives very little time for legends to creep in. Number one. Number two, the people who are around can verify the claims. Number three, Paul would definitely not be writing, or no writer will be writing to someone who knows who knows what is happening around and intentionally be lying to them about certain claims. Like, it's not really likely from a historical perspective. So in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 15, he defends the resurrection. This is because the Corinthians starts imbibing ideas from the Greco-Roman world that the idea of a resurrection is an absurdity. And in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 4, 5, and 6, Paul delivers a creed that most historians believe is a creed that predates Paul himself, probably to about within 2 or 3 years of Jesus' death. So this is why Paul says that I deliver to you what I have myself received. And that was a rabbinical way at the time of saying that delivering a tradition that I have received to you. So the contemporary equivalent would be someone quoting and putting a footnote. So what that means is that it's not original to Paul. And in that quotation, or in that like tradition that Paul is delivering, it states that Jesus Christ died, he was buried, he rose again on the third day, that he was witnessed by about 500 people at the same time, by the disciples, he was witnessed by Paul himself and then James, which is like really significant. We'll come to that. So the second reason historians believe that this is not original to Paul is that it contains non-Pauline language. So Paul doesn't say 12, the 12. Paul says the apostles. So this is not something that you see in other parts of Paul's letters. And this is like a basic historiolinguistic way of determining whether what Paul is saying here is something that originated with him. It's not his language. And Paul says, according to the scriptures. According to the scriptures was one way most Jews at the time framed their creeds. So most historians believe that this is a creed that predates Paul. And it's not particularly strange when you realize that most religions at the time prefer to have creeds that made it easy to transmit their basic ideas to adherents, new adherents all around the world. So most historians believe that it predates Paul. And Paul's letter is 17 years after Jesus died. Most historians believe this creed goes to within 2 or 5 years after Jesus Christ, which makes it very early in comparison to other sources that we have. I'm going to reiterate reasons why this is reliable. One, it's proximate to the events. Two, it's within the lifetime of eyewitnesses who can discount the claims, falsify the claims, etc. You don't have any historical record of anyone falsifying the claims. Third, we have a number of like early church fathers who actually report correspondence with Paul and about his willingness to die, as well as the willingness of other disciples to die. So we have like early church fathers like Clement of Rome, Polycarp, etc., who were themselves willing to die because they thought Jesus rose from the dead. But they also reported that the disciples were willing to die. The reason this is significant is because if 500 people are claiming to see the resurrection of Jesus, Like, that's a really huge number. Or claiming to see the risen Christ, that's a really huge number. Besides that, Paul was a self-acclaimed persecutor of the Christians at the time. The reasons this is an unlikely narrative that was created is because, one, Paul is a leader in the church. Christians, including himself, have no incentive to create a narrative where one of their leading practitioners or one of the prominent people in their leadership was persecuting Christians. So it's unlikely that this was a narrative that was created. Second, if Paul was really going around persecuting Christians, there were probably a lot of people who witnessed it, because there were people who existed at the time who saw what was going on. So for Paul to come and claim that he was persecuting Christians when he was not, is something that could have easily been falsified. So this is the structure. You have 500 people who are reported very early on to have seen Christ. We have Paul, the persecutor of the church, who converted because he thought he saw the risen Christ. And we have James. So James is also significant. I spoke earlier on about Josephus. Josephus reported that James was a brother of Jesus Christ who was killed because of his faith. Now, the Gospels report that James did not believe in Jesus. James and the other siblings of Jesus did not believe in him when he was alive. This is not a narrative that is likely to have been created falsely by Christians, because, like, no one wants to create a narrative where one of the prominent people in the early leadership of the church didn't believe in Jesus, especially when he was a brother to Jesus. It hurts the credibility of the church. It hurt the credibility of the leader himself. So this is not like a narrative that was falsely created in terms of probability. So this is really important. So again, what do we have? 500 witnesses, we have James, and then we have Paul. So we have really credible historical evidence that these people thought they saw Jesus, number one. And number two, they were willing to die for it. It's reported by Josephus that James died for it. And then Clement of Rome also tells us that Paul died under the Roman Emperor Nero. So that is the third historical piece. Having established these three basic facts, there are two additional facts that make the resurrection even more historically probable. As the first is the religio-historical context of Jesus' life. So very early on within the Christian church, the believers believed that Jesus Christ claimed to be God. According to the Jewish Talmud, the Jesus Christ was sentenced to death because he was leading the people of Israel astray, and he was a sorcerer. What that means is that the Jewish Talmud, or the Talmud at the time, attributed Jesus Christ's miracles to sorcery. And two, it admits that Jesus Christ was preaching radical doctrines. So it really coheres with this whole idea of the resurrection. Because if you have really early evidence that the Christians believe Jesus Christ was God, we have one like historical source saying that the Christians worshipped a man called Christus as if he was a god. And then you have this claim by the Jewish Talmud that Jesus Christ was a sorcerer, and then he was performing miracles to lead the people astray. The religious historical context of his life really makes it more likely, especially when you consider the records of the Gospels. And the second thing is that Jesus Christ's disciples claim that he rose from the dead. And then the first place they started preaching that message was in Jerusalem, the place where he was crucified. That doesn't make sense for a number of reasons if it was a lie. Number one, if you want to create a false historical narrative surrounding someone who existed within your community, you'd probably go to a distant community to preach that. So if you want to claim that a very popular religious leader within your community died and rose from the dead, you probably go to maybe Johannesburg or Tokyo or somewhere far away where it's not easily falsified to preach it. But if you preach that in the community in which the person died, and then the message actually goes rapidly such that it takes like a big empire, it's not really intelligible without like a strange explanation. So this makes more sense in light of claims about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, or the resurrection of Jesus Christ being the inference to the best explanation. So that's the second claim that makes everything more likely. So when you take all of these facts together, the best explanation is that Jesus rose from the dead. In fact, historians who are not Christians have been trying for a very long time to give explanations for this. and all of them have fallen short. The explanation they recourse to now is a more philosophical explanation. But let's review a number of the historical explanations that have been trotted by attempts to criticize the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. The first one is the apparent death theory, that Jesus Christ did not really die when he was crucified, but then when he was put in the tomb, somehow he managed to come out, and then the disciples proclaimed his resurrection. The number of reasons this doesn't work. One, the Roman executioners were very skilled at their job. So it's unlikely that Jesus Christ survived on the cross. Josephus reports that during the first Jewish-Roman war, when the Romans crucified a number of Jews, and then when he came with the Roman general at the time, he saw 3 of his friends on crosses, and he begged for their salvation. So the Roman general agreed to have them taken down and then given the best Roman medication or care that could be given at the time. And 2 of them died. Only 1 of them survived. And this was an attempt to actually save them. So it's highly unlikely that Jesus Christ, who was killed under the most brutal conditions that the Romans could administer, survived. But second, even if he survived the 2, it's unlikely that his disciples would suddenly think that this is the risen Messiah and he has come to save us, because he'd have wounds all over his body, and it's unlikely they would think Jesus Christ was from the dead. So that is the first theory, and then it doesn't work. The second theory is that the disciples had hallucinations, and that doesn't work for a number of reasons. 500 people don't see the same hallucination. I don't have a dream, call you and tell you about my dream, and then you close your eyes and then we keep on having the same dream. It doesn't work that way. But second, Paul was in no psychological condition to have a hallucination because he was a persecutor of the Christian faith. So it doesn't really work. You have too diverse a group, you have too large a number, and then you have critics of Christianity becoming Christians because they thought they saw the risen Christ to the point where they were willing to die. And besides that, this doesn't account for the empty tomb. So it's an insufficient explanation. The third explanation that have been proffered by some historians and critics is that Jesus' disciples went to the wrong tomb. But that doesn't work for a number of reasons. Number one, you'd have to assume that all the disciples had permanent amnesia. They couldn't remember where Jesus was buried. Second, you'd have to assume that the Roman executioners, the Jewish leadership at the time didn't know where Jesus Christ's body was laid. And then third, you'd have to explain the hallucinations. So this is an insufficient explanation. So the contemporary response that is usually given by historians is that, oh, God doesn't exist. A resurrection is so improbable that any explanation is preferable. So they just can't explain it, but it doesn't necessarily make it true. And that is really insufficient when you consider the religio-historical context within which Jesus lived, and then other like pieces of evidence that actually make it highly, highly likely and certain that God exists. So we'll probably be discussing that in subsequent videos. But for now, I think it's really clear that there's really good historical grounds to consider the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a reasonable thing to believe. If you're a Christian, like, this is something you can learn from. This is something that you can put in your shelves to defend the truth of Christianity when you have to. And if you're an unbeliever, this is an opportunity for you to really look into the claims of Christianity and reconsider your position if you have to. Thank you very much for paying attention to this video. I'll see you some other time. Thank you very much for watching the video. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.